My dear son-in-law left me a voicemail on a Tuesday morning, in the most casual voice imaginable, like he was reminding someone to pick up milk on the way home, telling me to get out of my own house. He said the current arrangement wasn't working anymore. He said I was getting in the way. 11 seconds. That's all it took. And before he hung up, he called me by the wrong name. Not even close. Completely wrong. 4 years sleeping under my roof. 4 years eating food I bought. Driving a truck I co-signed for. Living inside a life I built from nothing with my own 2 hands. And he couldn't be bothered to remember what to call me. I've played that voicemail back more times than I can count. Not because it still hurts, but because I want to remember exactly how it felt the very first time I heard it. I was standing in my workshop in Portland, Oregon. Rain drawing long lines down the window behind the bench. A cup of coffee going cold beside the brass compass I'd been restoring. I didn't call back. I didn't move. I just placed my phone face down on the table, picked up the compass, and got back to work. That was the moment I had been waiting for. For 3 months. I needed a signal. He had just given me one. My name is Raymond Aldrich. I'm 62 years old. I spent 33 years designing bridges, not the glamorous suspension kind with the cables and the photographs, but the kind that holds up under ice and pressure, and 1,000 loaded trucks per day for half a century, without anyone noticing. The invisible work. The work that only gets attention when it fails. And that profession teaches you one thing above everything else. A structure looks completely solid right up until the moment it doesn't. The failure is never a surprise to the person who has been reading the load calculations all along. I had been reading the load calculations on my son-in-law for 4 years. I knew exactly what I was looking at. Honestly, when I heard those 11 seconds, I felt something I didn't entirely expect. Not rage, not humiliation. Something closer to recognition. The feeling an engineer gets when a stress fracture finally shows itself on the surface. Not panic, not grief. Just the quiet acknowledgement. There it is. There's the confirmation. The thing I already knew. Made visible. My daughter Claire married Marcus Stell when she was 31. I tried to like him. I want to be clear that I put real effort in. He was polished in the way that people are when they've spent years practicing the appearance of a thing rather than living it. He laughed at other people's jokes a half beat after everyone else, like he was waiting to see which way the room committed before he joined in. He shook hands with both hands, the grip that announces confidence it doesn't entirely feel. My late wife Eleanor would have read him in 5 minutes flat. She understood people the way I understand load-bearing structures, intuitively, completely, without needing to explain herself. She died 9 years ago. I have been navigating on my own compass ever since. The first year, Claire and Marcus lived up in Tacoma. Marcus ran what he described as a boutique supply chain consultancy, the nature of which I'd had explained to me 3 separate times, and still couldn't fully trace to a specific service or actual invoice. Claire worked as a radiographer at a hospital there. Then Marcus experienced what he called a contraction in the market. Clients had consolidated. Margins had compressed. The timing was simply difficult. Claire was newly pregnant. They asked if they could come stay with me in Portland for a few months while Marcus rebuilt his client base and they got their footing. I said yes before they finished asking. I didn't hesitate. Claire is my only child. My house has 4 bedrooms. I rattle around in it alone. Of course I said yes. Their daughter Lily was born 6 weeks after they moved in. She is the most important person in this story, and I want to establish that before I tell you everything else. Lily is 4 years old, and completely certain about everything, and she makes the world feel like something worth protecting. Everything I did with her at the center of it. The few months became a year, then 2, then 3.5. Marcus's contraction had no floor. He worked sporadically from my kitchen table, billing himself as a logistics strategist, which in practice involved a significant number of phone calls taken in my driveway and a very small number of documented client outcomes. Claire picked up shifts at a clinic nearby. Between them, they might have cleared $50,000 in a good year. Their spending suggested considerably more. 2 car payments, including a truck Marcus claimed he needed for reasons I never fully traced. A wardrobe for Marcus that Claire quietly described as necessary for credibility. Long weekends in Bend and Cannon Beach that Marcus called relationship maintenance trips. A business line of credit I had co-signed at his request, backed by one of my investment accounts. He had described it as a bridge loan, The word bridge means something very specific to me. It didn't mean the same thing to him. I want to pause here for a second, because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, why did you let it go on? 4 years. Why didn't you say something sooner? And I've asked myself the same question enough times that I think I finally have an honest answer. It wasn't that I didn't see it. I'm an engineer. I see structural problems. The issue was that I had spent so long believing that the job of a good parent was to absorb, to hold the weight, to keep the structure standing regardless of what it cost. I thought generosity and surrender were the same thing. It took 4 years and 11 seconds to understand they were not. The shift in Marcus's behavior happened gradually, then all at once. He began treating the house as a management opportunity. He reorganized my workshop without asking, moving my instruments to a corner shelf to make room for a rowing machine he used exactly twice. He started replacing the word please with the phrase we need to, as in, we need to talk about the cable bill, or we need to figure out the schedule for the front bathroom, my front bathroom, in my house. He suggested on 2 occasions that the workshop space was underutilized and might function better as a play area for Lily. He mentioned once, casually at breakfast, that a neighbor down the street had found real peace at an assisted living community in Lake Oswego. He said this without irony. He said it with the mild, concerned expression of someone doing you a favor. Claire said nothing. She was exhausted. She was working, and raising a child, and trying to hold a marriage together, and I think she had been inside the situation long enough that she'd lost the ability to see its shape. I understood that. I didn't hold it against her. But I noticed, the way I notice everything. The worst moment came on a Wednesday evening in March. Marcus was talking about a renovation he wanted to make to the back deck. Our deck, he called it, and I mentioned, quietly, that any structural modifications would require my approval since I held the deed. He looked at me across the table with that half-beat delay, the one where his face reorganizes itself, and said, "Raymond, no one is questioning the paperwork, but Claire and I are the ones who are actually here." Claire was refilling Lily's cup. Lily was drawing something on the back of an envelope. Nobody spoke. I excused myself, went to the workshop, closed the door behind me. I sat there for a long time. I restore old nautical instruments, compasses, barometers, sextants, marine chronometers. I find them at estate sales, usually tucked in the dark of boxes, their needles frozen or their crystals fogged, the mechanisms seized with neglect. I bring them back. It requires patience, and it requires knowing the difference between damage that is cosmetic and damage that has compromised the core, knowing which parts can be saved. That night I was working on a 1940s brass compass, gimbal ring corroded, needle drifted far from true. I ran my thumb along the housing and I thought about what Marcus had just said. The ones who are actually here. I thought about the mortgage I paid every month, the utility accounts in my name, the property tax statements addressed to Raymond Aldrich at 2847 Laurelhurst Drive, the grocery runs every Sunday, the $22,000 he had drawn on the business line of credit backed by my investment account over the previous 14 months, with 3 payments made and none in the 7 months since. And then I thought about a conversation I'd had with my attorney, Margaret Ford, about 3 months earlier. I hadn't gone to Margaret because of anything specific. I went because I believe in maintenance schedules. I had been watching the load calculations on this arrangement long enough to think I should have my paperwork current. Margaret asked me, almost as an afterthought as I was leaving, whether anyone other than myself appeared on any of my financial accounts. I told her about the business line of credit. I told her that Marcus had, about a year into the arrangement, asked me to add him as an authorized user on one of my investment accounts for what he called administrative convenience. She looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "Raymond, come back next week. I think we need more time on this." We spent that time. Over the following 2 months, we made quiet adjustments. Clean, careful, thorough. The kind of structural reinforcement that doesn't announce itself until it's tested. I sat in the workshop that night running an oil stone along a plane blade, and I thought, the preparation is done. The mechanism is in place. I am simply waiting for the signal. The voicemail was the signal. He called me Lawrence. Not close, not a reasonable mistake. 4 years in this house, eating meals at my table, and he called me Lawrence, either because he was too nervous to think straight, or because he genuinely couldn't be bothered to remember. I've turned that over many times. I'm still not sure which answer is worse. I played the message twice. Then I set the phone face down and got back to work. The compass needle needed just a little more. I called Margaret at 8 the next morning. She answered on the second ring. That's one of the reasons I've trusted her for 11 years. "Margaret," I said, "I think it's time to move forward with the things we discussed." A pause, one breath. "The voicemail? I have it saved." "Good. Come in Thursday. Bring everything." Wednesday evening I went through my files. I am organized by habit, and that organization had become, over the preceding months, strategic in a way that felt almost surgical. Property deed, Raymond Aldrich, sole owner. Utility accounts, Raymond Aldrich. Mortgage statements, Raymond Aldrich. Tax records back to 2017. The refinancing papers from 2 years prior, Marcus's signature on a loan drawn against my home equity for his business, which had since produced no documented revenue I could trace. The co-signer documentation on the business line of credit, with the repayment history carefully printed. And then the other thing, the thing I had been sitting on for 8 weeks. Bank records showing that Marcus had used his authorized access to my investment account to initiate 2 transfers I had never approved. $900, $1,400, moved to an external account I had never seen. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and my files, and I thought about Lily. She had fallen asleep on my shoulder 2 Thursdays ago while I was reading to her. Her fingers still curled around a green crayon she'd refused to put down even when her eyes were closing. I thought about how none of what was coming was going to be painless, and I thought about the fact that the pain wasn't something I had created. It was something Marcus had been building for 4 years, brick by careful brick. The collapse was his architecture. The only question that had ever really been mine was whether I would keep holding the structure up or step back and let physics work. I believe in physics. Thursday's meeting with Margaret lasted 4 hours. We covered the property, the accounts, the business line of credit, and the fraud documentation. She looked at the transfer records for a long time before she looked up. "You've had these for 2 months. I wanted everything else in order first." She closed the folder. "Raymond, this is not just an eviction matter anymore. This is potential financial fraud. I'm aware. How would you like to proceed? Carefully. Legally. In a way that leaves no room for a second attempt." She nodded once. "That is very much my preference as well." We set the fraud documentation aside as a reserve. The eviction and financial separation would move first. The other card I would hold until I needed it, or until I didn't. I drove home that evening through the November rain, the Willamette reflecting city lights through the windshield. I've lived in Portland 20 years. Eleanor loved the rain here. She said Portland didn't try to look beautiful, it just was. I made dinner that night and sat at the table with Claire, Marcus, and Lily. Marcus was on his phone through most of the meal. Lily wanted to tell me about a dream involving a talking lighthouse that was also, somehow, a school bus. I listened to every detail. After dinner I did the dishes. Marcus did not offer to help. I noticed this without any particular emotion, not anger, not contempt. Just the calm, clear-eyed observation of someone who has already made every decision that matters and is simply watching the approach. The 30-day notice was served by a process server on a Monday morning. I was having breakfast at a diner on Hawthorne with my friend Hank Overbeck, who I've known since graduate school, and who was the only person I had talked to about any of this in the 4 years it had been unfolding. Hank listened to everything over eggs and black coffee. He asked 1 or 2 questions. Then he said, "Raymond, it's about time," and changed the subject to the Blazers. My phone began ringing at 9:53 a.m. Marcus. Then Claire. Then Marcus again. I turned the ringer off and ordered a second cup. The notice was precise. Raymond Aldrich, sole owner of the property at 2847 Laurelhurst Drive, Portland, Oregon, was formally requesting that current occupants, Marcus and Claire Stell, either enter into a rental agreement at market rate, $2,200 monthly, consistent with comparable properties in the area, or vacate the premises within 30 days. Failure to comply would initiate formal eviction proceedings under Oregon Revised Statute 105.105. I had asked Margaret to include the statute number. Specificity is a form of respect for your own position. I answered Claire's call that evening. She was crying, which I had anticipated, and I let her go for a while before I said anything. "Dad, you can't do this. Where are we supposed to go? What about Lily?" Lily is always welcome with me. The question is where the four of you will be living, and right now you have 30 days to figure that out. Marcus says this is illegal. He says you can't evict family. I have owned this house for 20 years, Claire. My name is on every document that has ever been associated with it. The law is quite clear. He's talking to an attorney. He's welcome to. Mine is Margaret Ford. She's been practicing Oregon property law for 26 years. He should mention her name to whoever he calls, as a professional courtesy. Silence on the line. A long one. Then, quietly, why didn't you just come talk to us? I thought about the Wednesday dinner, the ones who are actually here. I thought about 4 years of small erosions, the instruments moved to a corner shelf, Eleanor's photograph taken off the mantel because Marcus mentioned once that it made the room feel heavy, the casual, steady work of making me feel like an inconvenience in my own life. I've been talking, I said. I've been talking for 4 years. She didn't have an answer for that. I told her I loved her, that nothing about this changed that, and that the most important thing she could do was think clearly about what she actually wanted her life to look like. Then I hung up and went to the workshop. I sat with the compass for a long time without touching it, just holding it. If you have ever been the person in the room who was too polite, or too afraid, or too tired, to say what needed to be said, I want you to hear something directly. Staying quiet is not the same as being gracious. Sometimes, silence is simply the long, slow way of erasing yourself. You tell yourself you're being patient, being generous, being the bigger person, but there comes a point where none of those things are true anymore. You're just choosing disappearance over conflict, and calling it love. I did that for 4 years. I don't recommend it. Marcus found an attorney. Margaret received a letter from a firm in Beaverton, asserting that her client had established a reasonable expectation of continued tenancy by virtue of his 4-year occupancy, and could not be removed without demonstrated cause. Margaret's response was 1 page. It cited the deed, the absence of any rental agreement, the absence of any documented financial contribution to housing costs by the named occupant, and 4 years of utility, mortgage, and tax statements under my name alone. In the final paragraph, she noted that her client was in possession of documentation regarding potentially fraudulent financial activity by the occupant, and that this documentation had been preserved and was available to law enforcement upon request. Marcus's attorney did not respond. The 30 days expired on a Thursday. By that point, Claire and Marcus had located a 2-bedroom apartment near the Reed College neighborhood, $1,400 a month. I know this because Claire told me, in a phone call that was the first genuinely honest conversation we had managed in years. She sounded exhausted, but underneath the exhaustion was something I recognized. A quieter register, a more direct cadence, the particular way someone speaks when they've been somewhere very loud for a long time and have finally stepped outside. I didn't know about the account transfers, she said. He told me you'd approved them. I know he told you that. He said it was an equipment expense for a client project. He said many things. She went quiet. Then, I'm going to figure things out, Dad. I don't have the full shape of it yet, but I am. I know you are. How can you possibly know that? Because you're Eleanor's daughter. She cried a little at that. So did I, though I will not admit it to anyone except Hank. The morning they moved out, I sat on the back porch with my coffee and didn't watch. I could hear everything, the truck idling in the driveway, the voices, the particular kind of noise that leaving makes in a house. Around 9:30, Lily knocked on the porch door, still in her pajamas, holding a drawing. "This is for you, Grandpa," she said. It was a house with a yellow sun over it and 2 figures in the yard, one tall, one very small. I held it carefully. "Who is this tall one?" "That's you." "And this one?" "Me." "Where are we going?" She considered this with the absolute certainty of a 4-year-old. "Nowhere. We live there." I held her until Marcus called her name from the driveway. "I want to be honest with you. I'm not sure I have words adequate to that moment. What I can tell you is this. I have spent 15 years restoring old instruments. I have taken broken, neglected, presumed hopeless things and brought them back, piece by piece, with patience and the right tools. And Lily standing on that porch with that drawing in her hands felt like proof that some things were never broken. They just needed the noise around them to finally go quiet. The business line of credit resolved 2 weeks later. The backing collateral separated. The lender conducted a solo credit review of Marcus as sole borrower, He did not pass the threshold. The outstanding balance of $31,000 was called due in full within 15 days. He couldn't cover it. The account went to collections. The default was reported to all 3 credit bureaus. I did not forward that information to anyone. I didn't need to. In October, Margaret called me about the unauthorized transfers. She had consulted with a colleague who handled financial crime. The documentation was clean, the amounts were small, but the pattern was clear. She asked how I wanted to proceed. I sat with it for 2 days. Then I called the number of a detective named Sandra Howell at the Portland Police Bureau, and yes, the first name stopped me for half a second the way certain things still do, and I made an appointment. I want to be direct about this part. I didn't go to the police because I wanted to destroy Marcus. I went because what he had done was a crime, and because sitting on evidence of a crime for my own comfort would make me complicit in whatever he did to the next person who let him close enough to try. That is not mercy. That is just trading your peace of mind for someone else's exposure. It would have been the least loving thing I could do for my daughter, and the least responsible thing I could do for anyone Marcus might approach next. Detective Howell was methodical and unhurried. She reviewed my documentation in silence for a long time. Your records are very thorough, Mr. Aldrich. I'm an engineer. This is sufficient to open a case. Then I would like you to open one. Marcus was notified of the criminal investigation by mail in November. His attorney responded on his behalf. The process moves at the pace it moves, and I accepted that without impatience. A failing structure doesn't collapse on your schedule. You observe, you document, you wait for the math to complete itself. I found out through Claire, not through any legal channel, that by December she had initiated a separation. She called me on a Sunday evening, her voice different in a way I noticed immediately, quieter, more present, less like someone managing a situation and more like someone who had finally stopped performing the management of it. He transferred money from your account, she said. I know you didn't approve it. He told me you did. He told me you knew about a lot of things. A pause. I keep thinking about all the things he told me you knew about. I imagine there were several. Dad. Her voice shifted. I'm sorry for all of it, for not seeing it sooner, for not saying anything when he talked to you the way he did, for letting it go on as long as I let it go on. You were in it, I said. It's very hard to see from inside. You saw it. I was on the outside. That's the only real advantage of getting older. The view eventually gets clearer. She laughed, and surprised herself by laughing, and we talked for nearly 2 hours. The longest we had talked in years. She told me about Lily's new preschool 2 blocks from the apartment, about picking up more shifts, about the specific relief of a smaller space that was entirely hers. She sounded like someone who had been carrying a very heavy thing for a long time, and had finally set it down and was still getting used to the unfamiliar weight of her own hands. Before we got off, she said, Can I bring Lily this weekend? I'll make the pancakes she likes. The blueberry ones? Obviously. She is going to completely lose her mind. I am counting on exactly that. In the weeks after they moved out, I quietly restored the house to how I liked it. Not dramatically. Not as an act of erasure. Just a steady, patient reclamation. I moved the furniture back to positions that made sense to me. I reclaimed the workshop. I put Eleanor's photograph back on the mantel where it had been before Marcus mentioned, once that it made the room feel heavy. I found 2 of my instruments, a brass barometer and a small hand-bearing compass, shelved in the guest room closet behind a box of golf equipment I had never seen used. I brought them back to the workshop bench and stood there for a minute, just looking at them. Things that were mine. Always had been. Temporarily displaced. If you have ever walked back into a space that was yours, and felt, in the silence of it, the particular weight of what had been taken that you'd never quite named, you understand what that minute felt like. You don't celebrate it. You just stand there, and breathe, and feel the floor hold. In January, I had coffee with a woman named Patricia Ewan, who I had met at a maritime history lecture downtown. She's 60 years old, and she restores antique maps with the same patient, methodical attention I give to instruments. She has a dry sense of humor, and she asks real questions, and she listens to the full answer, which sounds like a remarkably low bar until you've spent 4 years next to someone who does neither. I mention her not because she's the destination of this story. I mention her because she's part of what the story is actually about, which is not Marcus, and not the legal proceedings still working through the system, and not even justice, exactly. It's about what remains when you stop subsidizing your own diminishment. It turns out quite a lot remains, more than I had let myself believe, more than I had given myself permission to want. Lily comes every Saturday now. We have a system, blueberry pancakes, then whatever project she's designed that week. 2 weeks ago, it was a model lighthouse she wanted to build so that her toy boats, in her words, don't get lost in the dark. We worked on it for nearly 3 hours. She held the pieces while I assembled them, gravely serious about every stage of the operation. When it was finished, she put her hands on her hips and studied it the way I study a completed restoration. Then she said, "Grandpa, that one's good. I think so too. The light should probably actually work next time." She considered this and nodded, like we'd agreed to a binding contract. I don't think much about Marcus anymore. His case is still moving through the system, and Margaret keeps me informed of the significant developments, and I respond when I need to, and otherwise I let it run the way a well-designed mechanism runs, without requiring my constant supervision. Claire texted me last week. She'd been offered a full-time position at an imaging center in Northwest Portland. Better hours, closer to Lily's school. 3 exclamation points at the end of the message. 3 more than she had used in any text she sent me in 4 years. I wrote back, "Eleanor would be proud. So am I." She sent a heart. I looked at it for a moment. Then I went back to the bench. I keep the voicemail. Not because the legal case requires it. Margaret has certified copies of everything. I keep it because 11 seconds changed the direction of my life. And I think there is something worth preserving in the memory of exactly how it felt. Standing in the workshop with the rain against the window and the coffee going cold. Listening to a man who had eaten my food for 4 years call me by the wrong name and tell me I was in the way. A fixed point only becomes an obstacle to something that's moving. He assumed I was fixed. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about most things. People ask me whether I regret waiting as long as I did, whether 4 years was patience or just fear, whether I was studying the situation or just refusing to admit what I already knew, because knowing would require acting, and acting would require confronting how much had already slipped. I've sat with that question. Here is what I've come to. There is a difference between tolerating a situation and mapping it. I wasn't absorbing the damage. I was reading it. Every structural engineer I've ever respected will tell you the most dangerous thing you can do with a failing structure is react before you understand the load, before you know which elements are bearing real weight and which only appear to be. Move too fast, you make it worse. Take the time to understand the system. Then move once, cleanly, in a way the structure cannot argue with. That's what I did. The hard nights were hard. I want to be honest about that. There were evenings I sat in the workshop holding an instrument I wasn't really working on, just needing something solid in my hands. Thinking about Eleanor. Thinking about Claire at 9 years old asking me to explain how bridges stayed up, standing on the Hawthorne Bridge in the October light pointing down at the water. Thinking about the life I had planned and the version I was living. Those nights were hard. Hard is not the same as wrong, not the same thing at all. What I keep returning to, the thing that feels most true when I sit with it quietly, is that Marcus was not the real problem. Marcus was a symptom. The real problem was that I had confused love with unlimited absorption. I had believed that being a good father meant holding the structure up regardless of what it cost the foundation. That saying nothing was the same as being gracious. That keeping the peace was more important than keeping myself. It took 4 years and 11 seconds to understand that none of that is love. That is the story a person tells themselves when drawing a line feels like failure, and failure feels like evidence of all the things they are afraid they might be. Unnecessary. Finished. Obsolete. The line wasn't failure. The line was the whole point. Here is the one practical thing I want to offer. If you are currently absorbing something you have been absorbing for years, I want to suggest you talk to someone who knows what your options actually are, an attorney, a financial advisor, whoever is appropriate to your situation. Not to act immediately, just to know. There is a version of power that comes not from confrontation but from preparation, from understanding your own position with precision, from knowing, quietly, exactly where you stand. Once you have that knowledge, you are no longer waiting helplessly. You are simply waiting for the moment. Ask yourself this: is what you're calling patience actually preparation? Or have you been staying still because you don't yet know you have the option to move? Claire is doing the hard work. She's rebuilding with her eyes open and her hands out, and she is not asking anyone to absorb the weight of the choices that were hers to make. That takes character. The kind that doesn't come from easy circumstances. It comes from going through difficult ones without looking for shortcuts. I'm proud of her in a way I can't fully articulate. Lily is 4 years old and absolutely certain about everything, which is probably the most important kind of certainty available in this world. The brass compass I finished the night the voicemail came in sits on the top shelf of the workshop. The needle is true. The gimbal ring moves freely. The crystal is clean. I look at it sometimes when I'm beginning something new. It reminds me that the work is real, the patience is real, and that knowing which parts can be saved is not the same as giving up on the whole. It never was. That's all any of this ever required. Before I go, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment. Type 1 if you think Raymond did the right thing by preparing quietly before making his move. 2 if you think he should have drawn the line far sooner than he did. Or 3 if you're still sitting with it, and you haven't decided yet. I mean that. There's no wrong answer here, and I want to know where you land. Also, where in the world are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? I'm always genuinely surprised by the answers. And if you have ever been in a situation where someone slowly, persistently made you feel like an inconvenience in your own life, I want you to know that this channel exists because stories like that deserve to be told carefully and heard completely. Drop something in the comments. You don't have to give details, just let me know you're there. If this story reached you, if it stayed with you past the last minute, please subscribe, not for the numbers, because we are going to keep telling stories like this one. Stories about people who took the quiet, careful, harder road and came out the other side with something that genuinely belonged to them. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Portland, Oregon, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.